record button, Costa. Okay, Kalisperas, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Greek Community Melbourne Public Seminar Series, to today's online seminar. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to the members of the South Sudanese community who may be following us on Facebook or our YouTube channel. As I've mentioned in previous seminars, the seminars program has been extended this year. It'll probably go on until the end of November. If you go on the Greek Community website under the education menu, you'll see the program until at least the end of October. So we will keep you sort of company every Thursday night until the end of November. And also just a reminder, we are open for sponsorship. You can sponsor a seminar of your choice at any stage during the course of the year. And also with respect to those who have registered through Zoom, you do have the ability to use the chat function. So feel free to send any comments through. I'll try and reply and answer them to the best of my ability. And just before the seminar is about to end, I will put in a call for questions. So you can submit your questions via the chat function. Let's make a start on today's seminar, The Greeks of Sudan, by Dr. Antonis Chaldeos. A bit of background on Antonis. He's a Greek historian, researcher, and writer. He was born in Athens in 1976, but his family origins are from Plomari on the island of Lesbos. Plomari is probably best known for its ouzo. You've probably seen it in stores, and probably a few other things. Initially, he started electronics engineering in Athens, so he's got a science background, and then he turned towards the humanities, majoring in social anthropology and history. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and his scientific field of study involves around the Greek diaspora. The way I've come across Antoni is that we both have a soft spot for Africa and have traveled extensively through the continent. Antoni is probably the foremost expert on diaspora.
We lost Nico, but we should have him back soon. Νίκο, Νίκο, δεν σ' ακούμε. Τώρα ναι.
And it's published books on the...
The last thing we've heard was that Antonis is the foremost expert in Africa. Continue from there.
Okay. Foremost researcher on the Greeks of Africa. He's extensively researched the Greek presence in numerous African countries and has published books on the Greeks of Morocco, Tunisia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Mozambique, Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Zambia, and South Africa. Apart from his 8 published books, I will put in the chat function, I will sort of put in a web link so you can see his blog spot and those titles. He has presented his work in international conferences and published in peer-reviewed journals. In 2017, he was honored with the St. Marcos Holy Cross from the Patriarchate of Alexandria for his contribution to the promotion of Hellenism in Africa. Furthermore, he has a very strong interest in the area of genealogy. In fact, the plan was to have him in Melbourne this time of year to conduct a genealogy workshop, but we had to abandon these plans due to COVID. Hopefully, we can resurrect this event next year in 2021. Today, Antonis will be speaking to us on the Greeks of the Sudan. Until 2011, before being partitioned into Sudan and the newly independent South Sudan, Sudan area-wise was the biggest country in Africa. No doubt there would have been some Greek presence in Sudan in antiquity, but in modern times, the first significant, say, Greek presence in Sudan, Greeks probably would have reached it in early 19th century with the Egyptian army. Probably Mehmet Ali would have been the ruler of Egypt at the time, and the Kavala-born Mehmet Ali would have encouraged many Greeks to move to Egypt and bring their expertise along. And as you know, Egypt borders Sudan. An increasing number began settling there, even in its more desolate areas, assisting in opening up the country. And at one stage, they became the most populous European community. Greeks were among the protagonists in Sudanese political and economic history. They actively participated in Sudan's economic transformation during the first quarter of the 20th century. And in more recent times, Greeks were also present in the struggle for South Sudan, which led to its eventual independence in 2011. But enough from me. I'll leave you with Antonis to continue the story. Antonis, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to Australia. Good afternoon or good morning to the Greeks who lives or the other people who lives in the other part of the world. Thank you very much for your invitation to talk about the Greeks of Africa and specifically about the Greeks in Sudan. As you have correctly said, the Greeks live in Sudan till the ancient times. I mean, in Sudan, there are lots of ancient inscriptions that are written in the Greek language, and that proves that the Greeks were there a long time ago. However, today we will talk about the modern Greek presence in Sudan, and specifically, we will start this history to the past, starting from the mid-18th century. Now, let's start, first of all, with the history of the Greek presence, and then we will talk about specific parts of their presence. I mean, about their social presence in the Sudanese history, their economic rule, since the Greeks were the pioneers of the founding of the modern Sudan, and that is something that most people admitted, even today, that the Greeks are not so many that they are used to be. And we'll talk about their presence in the education and things that were related to culture.
And don't possibly close your video. We're not getting very good reception, so you might want to close your video. That's all, in case audio quality improves.
I'm not sure if it's possible for Antonis to close his video without turning off his sharing, Nick. So
okay, yeah, not to worry. Just continue. Just continue. Yep.
Okay, can I go on?
Yes, please continue.
Okay. So today we'll talk about the modern presence of the Greeks in Sudan. This research was during my PhD thesis in the University of Johannesburg. As you can see in the cover of my book, the pyramids that you see in the cover are proof that within these pyramids, lots of inscriptions that were written in the Greek language were found. Okay, first, as I've told you, we'll talk about the history of the Greeks in Sudan. Sudan till 2011, when it was divided into two countries, Sudan and South Sudan. It was the largest country in Africa. More than 2,600 tribes and 400 language groups exist in this country. And the basic differentiation between Sudan and South Sudan is the origin of the people. I mean, those who live in North Sudan are of Arab origin, and those who live in South Sudan are native tribes, and most of them are Christians. Here, with the red line, you can see the borders of the two states that we know nowadays. North Sudan is the Sudan that you know, and the South Sudan. If you see the position of Sudan on the map, you will see that its borders, the north, it borders Egypt. And that was an important factor in its history, both in a positive and in a negative way. And we will see what was it in the next part of our seminar. The first presence of the Greeks in Sudan dates back to the 17th century, when there are some records of Greek merchants in Sennar. Sennar is a part of Sudan to the east. Centuries ago, when the Europeans started to explore Africa, and one of the main things that they would like to do was to find where Nile River starts. And one of these explorers was James Bruce in 1768. Two of his guides and translators and the people who knew the region and were able to give him to find him the right way to the Nile were two Greeks, Michael and George. Unfortunately, we don't know their surnames. However, even in his diary and the books that Bruce published later, there is a reference to the role of these two Greek men. During the late 18th century, we have the story of two brothers, two Greek brothers from Zakynthos Island, whose surname was Gaetis. And their story was really fascinating because they went to Egypt to work as military officers for the local bey, the local Pasha, the ruler of Egypt. However, the local Pasha sent them to Darfur. Darfur is on the west part of Sudan, and those people were used as the guides that were about to negotiate with the local ruler in order the Bey of Egypt to expand his jurisdiction. However, those guides were involved in a rivalry between these two rulers, and unfortunately, they didn't have a good end. Both of them were killed by the Sultan of Darfur. And this was the presence of the Greeks till the late 18th century. The major part of the Greeks regarding the massive immigration to Sudan started in 1821. It was that period of time that the Greek community was formed. And this immigration started from Egypt. It was connected with the campaign of the Egyptian ruler, the Muhammad Ali Pasha, and his son, Ibrahim, who decided to expand their rule to Sudan. And a lot of Greeks were part of this army, either as doctors or providers. They provided food to the army, or as translators. So the first Greek entered Sudan that period of time. It was the time that the Europeans scrambled for Africa. And when we talk about European scramble, we mean about the attempts of the European powers to exploit the resources of Africa. I mean, to expand their power over Africa regions in order to establish colonies. So this period of time, lots of European powers were started to invade Africa. And we talk about invade because it was during the colonization. That period of time, the state of the international economy changed. I mean, the European countries tried to find new sources in order to use them in their homelands, or to use that as sources for their own factories. I mean, the mid 18th or the 19th or the early 19th century. Another important factor for the Greek presence in Sudan was the discovery of East Africa. And when we say discovery, when the Suez Canal was found in 1869, ships were able to travel through the Red Sea and through Aden in order to go to India and later to Australia. Till that time, whoever wanted to go to India or to the East in general would have to cross from the west part of Africa down to Cape Town and then follow a route to the east. So the Suez Canal was the starting point for the construction of ports to the east part of Africa. And one of these was in the territory of Sudan. This port was named Suakin and later was named to Port Sudan. So, as I told you, the main reason of the European colonization in Africa was the exploitation of resources, the mines, the agriculture, the livestock. And in order to make this possible, they tried to build the railway throughout Africa in order to connect the ports to the inland, in order to be feasible for the goods to be transferred from the inland to the port and then to Europe. The Greeks in Sudan, as I have already told, immigrated in 1821 during the period of the Egyptian campaign organized by Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was born in Kavala, Greece. As I told you, some of the Greeks that took part were doctors, like the one that you can see in this photo. And there were also translators and supplies providers. This campaign made more Greeks that used to live in Egypt to settle in Sudan and deal with trade. Most of the Greeks who traveled in Africa got involved in trade activities. And Sudan was one of these regions where Greeks were really successful in this part. As I've told you, one of the main ports that were established to the east of Africa was Suakin. Suakin, that's named the Port Sudan nowadays, and it is in Sudan. Lots of Greeks settled there. Most of them were from Lesbos, the island that I come from. However, there were a few Greeks from Samos and other parts of the continental Greece, from Peloponnese, for instance. Those Greeks were dealt with the trade, and most of them provided the ships that were traveling to the east, to India or Australia. When I was in Sudan 6 or 7 years ago, during an interview with a Greek of third generation who still lives in Khartoum, in Sudan, he told me a story about his grandfather who used to live in Suakin, and he traded salt because salt was a necessary product for the ships in order to preserve food for those ships that traveled to the east. And his grandfather, Nick Marcatos, sorry, was traded an ounce of salt for an ounce of gold. So you can understand how valuable was the salt during that time. And of course, he made a fortune that time. Few Greeks were also settled apart from Swak in other parts of Sudan. In Khartoum and other cities to the east, like Gidar. Most of them were traders, and they traded goods with the local people, or they traded goods with Ethiopia. I mean, if you can see, Ethiopia borders Sudan to the east. During the 1870, a Greek business company, that of Kotskas, was the main provider of the Ethiopian court. They provided the Ethiopian emperor with goods and weapons. Another significant trader of the mid-19th century was Averov. Averov is a well-known Greek benefactor who immigrated to Egypt in the 1830s. And ever since he became a very wealthy person whose business expanded to Sudan and of course Egypt, and then to other parts of Europe like Odessa, London. And that man traded goods in a few parts of Sudan, included Khartoum, and a place in Omdurman. Omdurman is the old capital of Sudan, close to Khartoum, where there is a part, there is a suburb near the Nile River, which is called Aburov. Aburov, it's a transliteration of the name of Averov, because in this part of the river, Averov ships were trading goods. Things changed in the history of the Greeks in Sudan. In 1881, it was the time that a person was born in Sudan, and this person was Mahdi. Mahdi was a prophet who wanted to liberate Sudan from the Egyptian. The Egyptian who were really bad towards the Sudanese, either through the taxation, which was extremely heavy, and their behavior towards the local people. So Mahdi took advantage of the situation and started a revolution. He wanted to liberate Sudan, and he started a war. This affected everyone that used to live in Sudan that period of time, and among them were the Greeks. Here you can see the map. In 1884, Mahdi began a siege against Khartoum. That period of time, 163 Greeks used to live in Khartoum. there was a Greek consul, Leonidas, and when most of the Europeans and the Egyptians that used to live in Khartoum were trying to escape in order to save their lives, the Greeks remained in Khartoum and were among those who tried to defend Khartoum till the end, till the January of 1885. The British, the Gordon, who was the general of that was appointed by Egypt as the ruler of Sudan till 1885, called the Greeks the descendants of Leonidas, and he was talking in his diary that as Leonidas tried to defend Thermopylae, the same did the Greeks that used to live in Khartoum in 1885. The Mahdi forces finally entered Khartoum, and despite the efforts of the Egyptian and the few Greeks that tried a few days before the fall of Khartoum to travel through a steamboat in order to go to Egypt and get some help from the British who were there, and they didn't manage to. Khartoum fell to the Mahdi forces in 1885. The Greek consul was killed by the Mahdi forces, and most of the Greeks that used to live there that period of time in 1885. The life of the Greek that survived the fall of Khartoum was rather difficult. They were forced to become Muslims. They changed their names, and they were forced to get married to the Catholic nuns that used to be in Khartoum that period of time. Most of them had children that had families, and their descendants still live in Sudan nowadays. And till 1898, they lived in a neighborhood in Omdurman, which is called Masala, which is the region of peace. In 1898, things changed in Sudan when the British sent their troops headed by Lord Kitchener, and in order to liberate Sudan from the Mahdi force, in order to talk literally, to conquer Sudan in order to become a British colony. Few Greeks were involved in this campaign as providers of the army. They provided water and food to the army. There is a story of a Greek from my own village, from the village that I come from in Plomari, that that he had camels and horses, and he provided the British and the Egyptian forces with water at a distance of about 800 miles through the Sahara Desert. It was really difficult business, however, it was really successful for him. In 1898, the British conquered Omdurman, and then they moved the new capital to Khartoum, and it was the year that the Anglo-Egyptian condominium was established. It was a colony that was ruled both by the Egyptian and the British. It was the time that more and more Greeks settled in Sudan in order to work. to work in a few infrastructure projects that commenced in Sudan during that period of time. It was the time that most of the Greek communities were founded throughout Sudan. As we can see on this map, all the blue spots on it are the Greek communities that were formed between 1900 and 1940. During these 40 years, and we talk about the biggest country in Africa. You can see that the distance between the northern borders to the south are more than 2,000 miles, 3,000 miles. It's a huge distance, and you can see that the Greeks settled in every part of Sudan. The first community that were formed by the Greeks were the Greek community of Khartoum in 1902. And from the first time, the Greeks tried to establish a school and the church, things that they do in every part of the world where they immigrate. We can see how Khartoum was during that period of time. Lots of infrastructure works began, and more than 1,000 Greeks got involved in it, both in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan, especially Port Sudan, which was the main port of the country. And during the next decade, Khartoum changed dramatically, changed in a way that no one could recognize it if used to live there a decade earlier. Most of the buildings that were built at the time were made by Greek constructors like Loisa's family or Kapatos, who was a trader and was one of the main cooperators of the British authorities. And from the first time, the Greeks were involved in several fields of the economy, industry, apart from trade, in agriculture. We'll talk later about this, and they're involved in the cotton industry that was developed in Sudan. This is one of the first pictures that was taken regarding the Greek presence in Sudan, regarding the Greek community. It was in 1898, and the Greeks were among the other people. We can see the Greek flag here, who created this statue in order to welcome the British Duke of Connaught. In 1902, the Greek community of Khartoum was established, and this was the first president, Kostas Vikas. And within the next years, the Church of Annunciation was built. You can see how today. And gradually, the Greeks who settled in other parts of Sudan, in the North region, the Red Sea region, started to form their own communities. So the next community that was established was the Greek community of Port Sudan in 1906. And right after it, the Greeks built the Temple of St. Mark. The Greek presence in Sudan was connected with the railway. When the railway reached Port Sudan, more Greeks settled there. And in 1905, according to the British census that took part in Sudan that time, the Greeks were 100 and 400 people, when the British were 35. You can see that the British were the one who owned this colony, and the Greek were the biggest European community. This is a picture of Port Sudan. And as soon as the Greeks settled there, lots of them were built in ship handling. I mean, lots of them established the shipping agencies office and were built in the trade. One of them was Gerasimos Kontomichalos, who became the wealthiest man in Sudan, a man with his own bank, trade activities and branches throughout East Africa, from Egypt up to Eritrea and Djibouti, and with branches in UK, in London, in Paris, in several parts. This man was the most powerful person of Khartoum and, of course, Sudan for more than 5 decades. He was the main benefactor of the Greek community, not only in Khartoum but throughout Sudan. This is the church of the Saint Mark in Port Sudan. A factor that that helped the Greeks in order to travel and settle in several parts of Sudan was the expansion of the railway. When the railway reached the west part of Sudan, in Darfur, or the southern Sudan, when it reached in 1930, the Greeks started to settle in there and built with trade, as we have told, it was their main activities. And then they built with cotton plantations. I mean, they worked as mechanics, as engineers, and sometimes they were also the one who traded this cotton. But most of them used, those who built with cotton plantations, used to trade cotton with the British. They used to sell cotton to the British, and then they transferred it to UK. Between 1910 and 1920, the Greeks formed several communities in Gedaref, in Wad Medani, in the Blue Nile region, and in White Nile region. As you can see, every part and every blue spot on this map marks the Greek presence. One Greek that settled in the White Nile province was Kostas Mourikis, who settled in 1898. This man came from Peloponnese and started his trade activity near the White Nile River. That period of time, there was no settlement, there was no city, there was nothing. But since he was involved in the trade, lots of people starting to settle in next to him, and the small huts were transformed into small houses, and then this small settlement became a city. This city was named Kosti. It was named after Kostas Mourikis. And till nowadays, lots of people remember or have been told that the name of their city is after a Greek who settled there in the late 19th century. This is the church of the Greek church in Wad Medani. The Greeks also settled in South Sudan as we know it nowadays, either in the equatorial region in Jumba or in the Bahr el Ghazal region in Wau, even in Darfur. This is the church that the Greeks founded in Juba. Unfortunately, it's not in a good condition due to the civil war that Sudan experienced for almost half a century. As we have told, the period between 1920 and 1956 was the period of prosperity for the Greeks. Lots of communities were formed. The Greeks were involved in every part of economy. And for that reason, the Greeks were numerous in several cities of Sudan. At least they were the major European community. The main activities of the Greeks that settled in the eastern region were they're involved in cotton plantation, as I've told you. Egypt and Sudan were the main providers of the British factories regarding cotton. I mean, the main factories, textile factories that worked in Manchester and the other parts of northern England were imported the cotton from Egypt and Sudan. These are some pictures from the Greeks in Sudan during that period of time. In 1956, Sudan gained its independence, and although the British left Sudan, the Greeks remained there. They didn't have anything to fear of the new situation. The Greeks lived with the Sudanese in peace till nowadays, and they had nothing to be afraid of the future, as they did in several other countries of Africa. However, things gradually changed, either in the political or the economical field. Several coup d'etats that happened in Sudan with a major effect in economy, but most of all, the nationalization policy that Nimeiri imposed in 1969 and later in 1977 made the Greeks to leave Sudan. Things became even worse in 1983 when the Islamic law was imposed, and the Greeks who were involved in the alcohol trade were forced to close their business. And since they had nothing to do, they left Sudan and immigrated to other parts of the world, including Australia. A large part of the Greeks that used to live in Sudan moved to UK, America, and Australia as a result, and of course South Africa. One critical factor for the presence of the Greeks in Sudan was the civil war that affected the presence of all the people that used to live in Sudan. There was Greek involvement in this war, and specifically it was the descendants of Dimitris Yalouris. Dimitris Yalouris was a Greek from Lomari who immigrated to South Sudan in 1930. He got married to a woman from an indigenous tribe, had a few kids, including Vasilis Yalouris. Vasilis took part in the liberation war of South Sudan. He was one of the officials that was killed by the Sudanese army during that military campaigns, and an operation in the 1970s and the 1980s. Some of his brothers survived, and till nowadays, the descendants of Yalouris still live in South Sudan. Actually, the granddaughter of Yalouris, of Dimitris Yalouris, is the wife of the president of South Sudan. After 1969, when the nationalization policy was imposed by Nimeiri, the Greek communities were starting to dissolve. Lots of them were ceased their operations, and lots of Greeks left Sudan. Here you can see the community hall of the Greek community in Chumpa, as it is nowadays after the end of the civil war. and some of the houses that used to be Greek ones in Junta. As we told, the Greeks were involved in several parts of Sudan, and the Greeks were not involved only in the trade and other fields of the economy. From their first presence in 19th century, in 1900, I mean in the early 20th century, the Greeks tried to form education institutes in order to preserve the Greek identity and the Greek language. This is the first Greek school that was founded in 1905 by Trampas, a Greek who used to live in Khartoum and donated his house in order to become a Greek school. But later, the main benefactor of the Greek educational institutes was Gerasimos Kondomikalos. This is the building of the Greek high school that for more than 5 decades used to be the school for the Greek pupils. Nowadays it is an international school. It is run by the Greek community of Khartoum. And apart from the Greek pupils, lots of pupils from other nationalities can be enrolled. This is the Kondomikalos school that we have talked a few minutes ago. This is the parade of the pupils during the celebration of the 28th of October. A few Greek schools were founded in other parts of Sudan, like in Port Sudan, in Wau, in Wat Medani, several parts. The Greeks also established associations and clubs. The Cypriots who used to live in Sudan formed their own club in 1922. And one of the foremost associations of the Greeks in Khartoum that still operates is the Hellenic Athletic Club, which was formed as an Hellenic shooting club in 1907, and a few years later, in 1913, it was established as a football club, a basketball club, a swimming club, a club with main activities. And till nowadays, it's still active, and it's got a basketball team, which is really good. And in the past, as we've told, it used to have a football team. It was among the first football teams that were established in Sudan. And in the 1954 and 1956, it was among the most successful. You can see the trophies. The Greeks also founded basketball teams for women. And apart from the sports activity, they formed also cultural clubs like Apollon, where they hosted theater performances and concerts. Lots of Greek famous actors traveled from Greece in order to perform in Khartoum. Now let's talk about a few things about the origin of the Greeks that settled in Sudan. As we can see, the great majority till 1920 were from the island of Lesbos, because there was a connection between Lesbos and Egypt, and through the port of Alexandria, lots of Greeks settled in Egypt and then traveled to Sudan. There were a few Greeks from Carpathos Island in the Deccanese, Kefalonia Island of the Ionian Sea, and a few Greeks from Asia Minor and Cyprus. In 1922, after the Asia Minor blight, lots of Greeks from Asia Minor settled in Sudan, and Later in the 1950s, during the struggle of Cyprus in order to liberate from the British rule, lots of Cypriots immigrated to Sudan. And as a result, in the 1940s, almost 35% of the Greeks in Sudan were from Lesbos, yes, and about 10% were from Cyprus. The Greeks in Sudan were their number of fluctuates between 1,000 during the 1910s, when the decade of 1910s, when we have the first census that took part in Sudan, and during the time of prosperity in 1960s, there were about 6,000 in Sudan. And we talk about the Greek citizens. Lots of Greeks that used to live in Sudan became British citizens, British sovereigns, and then they had the British passport. So we cannot be quite sure how many Greeks were in Sudan during that time. But according to the Consulate of Khartoum reports and the censuses that took part in Sudan during this time, we can see that the Greeks were between 1,000 in 1910 up to 6,000 in 1950s or 1960s. And nowadays, there are unfortunately only 115 to between 150 and 200 Greeks living in Sudan, mainly in Khartoum and a few in South Sudan in Jumba. The Greeks were involved in trade, I was told. You can see a classical trade store in Sudan in the 1920s. I mean, almost 31.5% of the Greeks were involved in trade. Angelos Kapatos was one of the first Greeks whose activity expanded beyond Sudan. Angelos Kapatos was one of the Greeks that founded branches of his trade activity even in Congo in the 1920s. But as we have said, the most successful, the richest man in Sudan, with business activity in Sudan, Egypt, and other parts, was Gerasimos Kontomichalos, a man who donated money to all Greek communities that were found in Sudan. Lots of Greeks were involved in construction field, especially in the first quarter of the 20th century, during the period of the great works that took part in Khartoum, Portsmouth, and other parts. A few Greeks were involved in the railways as clerks and engineers. Some of them founded hotels, restaurants. This is a picture from the Great Britain restaurant founded by Pagulatos family. Pagulatos family is the owner of the Acropole Hotel that still remains in its position in Khartoum. And Acropole suffered from the civil war. It was shot by two missiles during the 1990s. An explosion took part in Acropole and a few people were killed. The Greeks also founded the newspapers till the 1910s. In 1911, the Greeks founded the Sudan Herald, and later the Sudan News and the Sudan. It was the first European newspaper that was founded in Sudan, and later Sudan Times, and then Sudan. The Greeks were involved in industry, like George Pasianos, another Greek from Lomari, who was involved in spirits industry. The Greeks, although lived in Sudan for a long period of time and they were involved in trade and other activities, they never forgot their homeland. They didn't forget their homeland even during the war of 1912, during the Balkan Wars. The Greeks of Sudan were among the first who left their families in Sudan, left their business, embarked on a ship, and then arrived in Greece in order to fight for the liberation of the Aegean Islands and Macedonia. Some of them were killed. You can see the name of those people who died between 1912 and 1917. The Greeks were ready to fight for their homeland during the World War II. We can see a picture of the Greeks who are ready to live in order to fight in the battlefront of North Africa, in El Alamein, and in other parts of Africa, where the Allied forces fought against the Nazis. Although the Greeks were in Sudan and they were influenced by the British, in the first part, the British regarded them as second-class Europeans. Although the Greeks were numerous and they were the biggest European community in Sudan, the British did not accept them in their own clubs. For that reason, the Greeks formed their own clubs. However, when the Greeks became wealthier, like Odomichalos, the British changed their way of thought, and they then started to accept the Greeks in their own association and activities. The Greeks were very close to the Sudanese. During their trade activities, the Greeks learned the local languages. They were friends with the local. They got married with the local women, like the Greeks in South Sudan and Greeks in several parts of Sudan. And till nowadays, they remain close friends. Their bonds are very close. The Greeks love Sudan. It is their second country, their second homeland. And the Sudanese admits that the Greeks took part in the modern history of Sudan. The Greeks, not only those who were wealthy and founded several institutions in Sudan and donated money not only to the Greeks but also to the Sudanese, we will talk about the story of a woman, a poor woman, Katarina Kaku, who was born in Port Sudan. Her father came from Leros Island and settled in Port Sudan in the 1880s. And Katarina was a poor woman who lost her husband at an early age and tried to provide their family, which consisted of many kids, with a few things that she could do. She tried to sell fruit and beans and all this in Khartoum. But although she was poor and she was struggling to provide her family, she gave money and she gave food to the poor that used to live in their neighborhood. The street that Katarina used to live was named Sarah Katarina Street. Until nowadays, Sarah Katarina used to live in the 1950s and 1960s, and nowadays Sudanese that used to live in Khartoum and are in their 80s or in the 70s remember Sarah Katarina to offer them fulia. Fulia is the name of the beans that they cook in Sudan, or offer them fruit. It's very important for a poor woman to offer even from the little things that she had from her own family. I would like to thank you for watching me, telling you a few things about the Greeks in Sudan. Of course, there are so many things, so many stories that you can read, you can learn. The Greek presence is by far fascinating. Of course, you can read more in my book about the Greek community in Sudan, which was published both in Greek and in English. You can read my book in my Facebook page as Greeks of Africa, or in my blog, which is greeksofafrica.blogspot.gr. or you can get my mail. As Nikos in the beginning told, I've been researching the Greek presence in Africa for more than a decade. I've traveled in many countries of Africa, and believe me, the Greek presence in Africa is fascinating, is adventurous, and you can learn a few things about the Greeks throughout the world if you have a look at their presence. Of course, you can learn a lot in my books, the ones that I have published so far. So I'm at your disposal for any questions or anything that you'd like to ask about the Greeks.
Thank you, Antonis, for that presentation. Numerous interesting photographs that you sort of put up there, and quite a nice story. There've been a few questions from our audience. Some questions I think were already answered through some of your slides in the later part, like the origins of most Greeks there. You had a few slides on the demographics, but I will read out some of the few questions that I haven't been able to answer. One question is, did the establishment of the community include a constitution? And if yes, was it registered to any authority, the Greek state, the Greek church, or the Sudanese state?
Okay. The Greek community was found, the Greek community of Khartoum was founded in 1902, and it was recognized both by the Sudanese authorities that were the one that ruled the British Egyptian in the beginning, because that time, that period of time, it was Egyptian and British colony, and then it was authorized by the Sudanese authorities. Of course, Metropolis was established later in the 1910s, and ever since the Greeks that used to live, or the Greeks that were born in Sudan, were registered in the Greek consulate records, in the Greek church, and they are Greek citizens.
Okay. Antonis, what's the present Greek population in Sudan at the moment? Both Sudan and South Sudan.
Yeah, yes, so. Yes. The Greeks are not more than 200 people, and they live in Khartoum and in Juba, in South Sudan. Most of them are descendants of the first Greeks that immigrated there in the late 19th century. However, there are a few Greeks that immigrated to Sudan during the last decade, due to the economic crisis that the Greek state experiences. Lots of Greeks immigrated to Sudan in order to find a better future.
Okay. A question we have from one of our followers here, from Ahmed Obeid. In the 1970s, there was a large population of Greeks in Port Sudan. And there was even a Greek district in Port Sudan. But then suddenly, towards the end of the 1970s, they left, where other community groups remained. What was the reason for their departure in the 70s? Like, apparently many Greeks left Sudan.
In 1905, there were about 1,400 Greeks that settled in Port Sudan in order to work in the infrastructure works that were in progress at that period of time. They worked in the creation of the port, in several projects that took part in the city of Port Sudan. And when this project finished, lots of them left Port Sudan in order to work in other parts of Sudan, in Khartoum or other parts that new projects were established. A great part of them were construction workers or construction engineers. And as a result, only those who were traders remained in Port Sudan. That's why the number of the Greek community remained at a small scale. I mean, only a few Greeks remained in Port Sudan after 1920.
Okay. although the community was small, were any Greeks involved in Sudan in trade union activities, or were any members of the Sudanese Communist Party?
No. Regarding North Sudan, no. Regarding Sudan, no. None of the Greeks was involved in the politics. Although the Greeks were among the most wealthier people in Sudan, none of them, even Kodomikalos, was really powerful, and he was really in contact with the British authorities. No, he didn't take part in politics. However, in South Sudan, as I've told, a few Greeks took part in politics, even as not quite politics. I mean, they were military officers and then took positions and authorities in the new government. As I've told, apart from the wife of the South Sudanese president, there are Greek commissioners, the Greek state governors in Baret Ghazal region, who is a descendant of Dimitris Yalouris, that man, the man who immigrated to South Sudan in the 1930s.
Antonis, when you look at the history of Greeks in the diaspora, a common theme tends to be the tension or the conflict between the community and the church. So one of our listeners here asks, what was the relationship between the Greek community of Sudan and the Greek church in Sudan?
First, I will talk in general. Firstly, the Greeks established a community. Then the Greeks established a church and a school. Most of the times, especially during the first period of the establishment of the Greeks abroad, the relationships between the church and the community are not so good, because both of them interfere in things that they didn't have to. I mean, the communities interfere in church issues, and the local church interferes in community issues, and this causes several troubles. I have come across several problems in Tunisia, especially in the 1920s, or in Sudan. I mean, there were issues between the Greek church, the founding of the Greek metropolis in Sudan, and the Greek community. And the problem was who was about to sponsor this metropolis, who was going to pay the salary of the local priest. And there was a problem between the Greek patriarchate in Alexandria and the Greek community. However, within the next decades, problems were solved, and ever since the Greek community and the Greek church coexist, and they cooperate, and there are no problems. However, this is a fact that happens throughout the world. I mean, I have come across the same things also in South America or in parts of North America. Now I don't know how things are in Australia, so I can not make any comment about it.
Antonis, just getting back to a previous question on the founding of the community, did that community have a constitution, and what was that sort of based on?
Yes, the Greek, all the communities that were founded in Sudan have a constitution, and this constitution was based on the constitution of Alexandria community. I mean, the constitution of the Greek community of Khartoum was based on the Greek community of Alexandria, and it was authorized by all the authorities that rule Sudan till nowadays. It is in effect.
Okay. We've got a question here from one of our followers on Facebook. Why did Port Sudan take over Suakin? So I assume he means, why did Port Sudan take over Suakin in terms of importance as a port or a city?
According to the British, who made several reports regarding the Great Port Sudan, was an area that was founded when Suakin ceased its operation. I mean, they thought that Port Sudan had the perspectives in order to host more ships that could connect Sudan to Europe. And they thought that Suakin was not suitable for this purpose. So they decided to build a new port in order to transfer the goods from the inland of Sudan to the Red Sea and then transport them to Europe. So for that reason, they decided to build a new port. And it was better for them to connect this port to the railway connection with Khartoum.
Okay, I think I'll just take one final question. Presently, in the Sudanese government, are there any members of Greek background? Or?
As far as I know, no, there are no Sudanese of Greek origin. Okay. There are members of the local parliament.
Okay. Antonis, it just remains for me to sort of thank you. Thank you for the interesting, sort of fascinating presentation.
Thank you all for the invitation.
You've put up. So if anyone wants to know more about the Greek presence of Africa, go to Antonis' blogspot or his Facebook page, and you'll find a lot more information there. Thanks once again for being on the line all the way from Greece. And we hope to have you back in some future seminar or maybe some future visit to Australia. You'll find many of your fellow citizens from Lesbos here as well. So have a good day and good evening to everyone, and hope to see you next Thursday's seminar.
Goodbye to all.
Doniola Kala.